In the middle of shooting From Beyond, I had to tell Charlie I was suing him. And so there was a little bit of stress there.
How are you doing? I love your background. Your posters look fantastic back there too, by the way.
Oh, wow. You got to put something up, right?
You definitely do, yeah. I'm well aware of the movies you've done and the things you've done, but I wanted to do a little bit of research when I was getting to learn about you. And when I read this, it sounds wild to me. So I'm just going to read this to you and you tell me how accurate all this is. So it says on your early life, you were born in the Philippines, grew up in Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, and Panama before moving to Atlanta. Is that all true?
Yeah.
Can you kind of break that down for me? Because that's pretty out there.
Well, it's my parents. My father was an engineer for the federal government, and in like the post-World War II, he was a road engineer, the Bureau of Public Roads, and he was working on a number of places, but mostly the Pan American Highway from Alaska down to Chile. And he and my mother both were from a very small town, a mining town on the boundary waters of northern Minnesota, both kids of immigrants. And then she went down to Nicaragua and married him, and they had my older brother. And then he went to Philippines, where my mother had me and my sister. And we ended up we stopped, I guess, in Portland. She had another kid. And then then we went down to Nicaragua, where he continued working on the Pan American Highway.
Uh-huh.
And after a few years, we moved to Panama, where we stayed for 7 years, during which I went for kindergarten almost through 6th grade, at which time we moved to Puerto Rico for middle school. And then I went to Atlanta for high school. I moved to Atlanta for 9th grade. So yeah, that's true. That's how it worked. Although I did end up doing a bunch of movies in Barcelona, Spain, and over there I kind of learned how to speak Spanish more
Right.
like a Spaniard than a Latin American. I made a short film and put it on VHS. I thought it was the best thing in the world until I watched it with a couple of my friends. And when I watched it with them, I realized it was a piece of shit. I didn't realize it until I saw it with somebody, and saw it through their eyes. Basically, I ended up, I loved underground comics, and I wanted to make a movie of this underground comic that this artist I really liked made. And he was splitting up. He was in Berkeley, and he was splitting up with his girlfriend. And so he came back to North Carolina and stayed at my art supply store. He'd lived there. And we developed one of his stories to make a movie, which neither of us knew how to write a script or how to do it. So he just drew the script. So it was really kind of a book of a storyboard.
Right.
And then I thought, I need to get I wanted to do it professionally. So by that time, I had been reading some movie magazines, not fan magazines, but like Box Office magazine, and I read Variety Weekly. And Variety, it was a daily with the Hollywood Reporter back then. They called them the trades. And they had a weekly edition that they sold all over the country. And so I put in a little ad in Variety that said, horror movie director wanted. And this is before this is like 1978. And 78, is that right? No, maybe 79 or 80 maybe. And I so that was before fax machines. So I just got a ton of letters back. And then I said, well, then almost all the letters, 80% of the letters came from LA, 20% came from New York. So now New York, I could just drive up to New York in one day from North Carolina. But I flew out to LA, and I would just have 6 meetings a day for 5 days. And I met people that I still know now. And I was trying to find a director. And I finally asked the cartoon artist that I was working with, Kim Deitch, his girlfriend that he'd split up with was Sally Cruikshank, who's just a brilliant animator. If you've ever seen the short films Quasi at the Quackadero or Make Me Psychic from the 70s, that's incredible stuff. And she did some credit sequences for some big kind of movies. But I called her to ask if she was living in LA, and she had married the guy who produced like Airplane, you know, and so she put me on the phone with him, and I said, I'm looking for a director, and he said I should talk to this guy named Bob Greenberg, who went to USC with all the rest of them. And so Bob Greenberg kind of became my way in to LA. At that time, I tried to. At that time, I met Bob Greenberg had written a documentary called Amos and Andy: The Anatomy of a Controversy, and so I got involved with that documentary and put some money up with this guy named Mike Avery, who was a lawyer. And I also got involved in selling public domain TV shows to these UHF stations, these dipshit stations all across the country that they were starting to have. Anybody could get a station, but you needed something to put on it. So what we were doing is he was a lawyer, so he'd go to DC. One of our partners was a guy named Ray Atherton, which is he was a big movie collector. So he collected all these movies, and we would just see what we had. You'd either kinescopes or 16 millimeter or 1-inch tapes, all kinds of stuff. And we'd see what we had, and the stuff we thought was public domain, we'd make a list. And back then, no internet, remember. To find out the copyright, you had to go to the Library of Congress and look it all up. Today, you can go online right now and look up all the copyrights you want. So my partner that was a lawyer would go there and figure out which ones had fallen out of copyright. And then he would do all the work, take it to a big time law firm to get them to sign off on it for $20. And we sold these packages. We called it the Golden Years of Television. And we made bumpers for it. I moved to LA up in Laurel Hills, and I had 2 kids by then. And so I took one of the bedrooms and bought a editing system that was just barely broadcast quality.
Wow.
And we edited, you have to edit the shows so that there's place for commercials, and you have to put your intros and stuff for the Golden Years of Television. And then we went to the markets, the TV markets, and just basically sold it by the pound, So we sold 400 hours of old TV shows, And actually, believe it or not, one of our good clients was Nick at Night. Nickelodeon had just started up.
No kidding.
Showing old. Nobody ever thought that you could show,
reruns and
Roy Rogers or Boston Blackie or Sid Caesar. What would it be 20 years later or 30 years later almost? And that's why the TV stations, studios, they didn't bother renewing the copyrights. See, the
They-
copyrights only have a certain number of years. Then you have to
Right.
pay another. Back then, you had to pay another $15. But they had so many episodes, they didn't want to pay the money because they never thought nobody's going to ever want to watch this crap again, right? TV was something. It was like going out to a
Always.
restaurant. You know, you just keep eating. Nobody thought that there'd be some sort of nostalgic factor, which was great for us because in public domain, the easiest public domain to prove is when they just don't renew the copyright. When it was copyright and they don't renew it. Okay, today that's never going to happen. One thing is copyright laws have been relaxed a little bit,
Right.
and also everybody thinks everything is worth something. Nothing, you know. There are things that are in public domain, of course, and in the VHS era, a few movies really benefited from not being protected by copyright. One famous one is It's a Wonderful Life. Another famous one is the Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, I got my poster right there.
So what happened on Night of the Living Dead, they were so strict then that they didn't put a proper copyright notice on the prints. So it went to public domain. And what that meant for these two movies was that every fly-by-night video distributor released that movie. And so when you went to the video store, there was no studios had hardly anything. And so to get a real studio picture, an important picture like Night of the Living Dead, every label had it out. So many people saw it. It's a Wonderful Life was not a movie that was successful when it first came out. It became successful on VHS. Right. So anyway, that was how I made a living while I tried to find a way to make a horror movie. And Charlie was making these genre movies, these cheap movies that I loved because they were like Roger Corman and William Castle, the stuff I grew up with. And that's what I wanted to do.
Right.
You know, I wanted to do Humanoids from the Deep. I want to do House on Haunted Hill. I want to do The Pit and the Pendulum. You know, that's the kind, I want to do those movies. I think everybody does. Everybody wants to make the movies that they loved when they were kids, just like you want to eat the food that you loved when you were a kid.
Sure.
And so I went to the set of a movie called Sword Kill that Albert was producing, but it turns out that Charlie, his son, was really the one that had the company.
Right.
And so Charlie had a distribution company, and he distributed VHS under Wizard Video.
Right.
And he went to the markets where you buy and sell movies internationally. And so I got to go to that. There's one in LA. And once I saw the market, I said, I get how you make money in movies. You go sell the rights.
Right.
I just never, I just didn't know how you do that because I didn't go to film school. I knew nobody in the studios. I wasn't looking for a job.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
I've never really worked for anybody. But then I saw that. I said, well, I'm going to make a movie. And Charlie said, well, I'll release it for you and do the sales. Well, that was a mixed blessing because it ended up in me suing him because he never paid the money and I had to sue. He kept the money. It's a typical, story.
He left that out of his book, by the way.
Huh?
I read his memoir that came out. He left that part out of the book, by the way.
Well, I always said that Charlie Band, I like Charlie as a person. He's a charming guy.
Sure.
I like Charlie because he's crazy for movies. He was since he was a kid. I like him because he always seemed a little ahead of the curve. And I always thought that if he wasn't ethically challenged, he would have been running a huge studio.
Right.
It's just that the guy can't keep his fingers out of honey pot. And so anyway, so I ended up You know, I made Re-Animator. He released it, wouldn't pay any of the money. Of course, we didn't know that because we were already making 2 more movies after that I financed Re-Animator. But then after it turned out so well, then we did back then the 3-picture deal on a napkin at the Majestic Hotel in Cannes film market, you know.
Yeah.
So we did that. Was what you did back then. It was in Cannes, you know, and so we did that, and so it was great to me because I did a 3-picture deal with them where I was coming in with Stewart, and I was being paid. I wasn't paying anything. See, on Re-Animator, I paid everything.
You forked up the
And
money
that was
to the
one of the
producer.
problems, is that you got to get the money back. You know, I'm not like a billionaire or something.
Sure.
And so we made dolls, and we did this in Italy. We made dolls, and then we took the set and converted it to another set and made From Beyond. And it was during From Beyond then that, and I was working also with Stewart at that time. We were planning Robot Jocks. And I also had gotten Dennis Paley to write a script based on Shadow over Innsmouth called Dagon. So we were moving along, and at that time we also we came up with this idea to pitch to Disney for Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and we got a deal there, and we were just cranking, except that in the middle of shooting From Beyond, I had to tell Charlie I was suing him. And so there was a little bit of stress there. And so anyway, I dropped out of Robot Jocks.
Robot Jocks.
And I started work, and Stewart stayed working with Charlie, right? And I couldn't, I just couldn't be working with somebody who wasn't paying me, who wasn't living up to their agreement. And it did cost a tremendous amount of money in lawyers to get that, to disentangle.
I bet it did.
From the distribution deal. And also, and by then it was actually wasn't, I did depose Charlie, but it was actually Vestron and a company called TWE, that Trans World Entertainment, that had taken over all the assets of Empire, because Charlie was always selling out his assets, because when I started working with him, I was discounting his video contracts. This guy could never make, he had a hard time making payroll, right? So he's one of those guys that spent more, was spending ahead of his income.
It's so funny you're going into this, because if you don't mind, I actually have a question that, like, if you could answer this, and I don't know if anybody else could. First off, let me pivot for just a second. I want to compliment you on your work on this. I watched my 4K of Re-Animator, and it's one of my favorite it's gorgeous. And I know you supervised it. It looked absolutely fantastic. And the story, the making of Re-Animator, it's so well documented. So I really don't want to ask you too much about the behind the scenes casting and all that. And by the way, you covered a lot of that on here as well, which again was fantastic. I wasn't planning to ask you this, but in Charlie's book, he claimed that Re-Animator was a complete dud in the theater. It made no money. Maybe one of the only Empire pictures he claimed made money in the book was actually Ghoulies.
Yeah, Ghoulies made money. But that's true. Yeah, I think it only made about $1 million at the box office. But that wasn't where the money was made.
That's my question. The
reason it didn't make money at the box office is because Empire, this was their second release. He was going into distribution, into theatrical. They just didn't have any experience. And I actually had a deal with another company, made an offer to me that would have put me way in the black like that with real distribution. But I told Charlie I want to do that. And he said, no, I'll sue you and nobody will get to release it. I've got a signature of yours. So I had to go along with it. It didn't $1 million for Re-Animator. You can look it up if that's what's in the trades. $1 million theatrically is not losing money. you know, on a $500,000 movie. And he put up no money. He put up nothing. He didn't put up a nickel in it. He didn't put anything in Re-Animator. I gave it to him to sell.
That's
So it's not
fascinating.
like he was losing money.
Right.
But the big thing was he had a little golden plaque in his office from Vestron Video when Re-Animator hit 100,000 units. 100,000 units of VHS in 1985. In 1985, if you were selling VHS for rental, the cost to the store was something like $60
per tape.
Yeah.
Jesus. So that's, I
Because
mean,
they're renting it. 100,000 times $60 is $6 million, and that doesn't include foreign. It was a big hit for him. The money was pouring in.
and you didn't see
Early before Re-Animator, I was helping him make payroll. After Re-Animator, he went and bragged about buying a castle.
He bought a castle.
Castle in Italy.
You had to have been pissed, Brian.
Well, I was. It was not being pissed. It was having your stomachs being eaten up by acid, you know, and spending 6 figures on lawyers. But anyway, that's not the story you want to tell here. Anyway, that's you know. So then I eventually got the movie back, but then I had to go off, and so I didn't work with Stewart after that. I did later, but he was all into Charlie and making the movies with Charlie. And I started making, although we were still working on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids together and a couple other projects that didn't get made. But then I just started, I started working with Dan O'Bannon on a project called The Men, about a woman that discovers all men are aliens. And Dan was going to write it. I was going to produce it. Stewart was going to direct it. But very early on, Dan said, no, I want to direct it. Well, Dan has directed Return of the Living Dead. I think he's quite qualified.
Okay, so this obviously was taking place after, is this like 89, 90 we're talking about time-wise, if you can recall?
No, this would be 86. Maybe.
86, okay.
Yeah, it'd be 86. And so I worked with Dan, and then we got the thing. I got financing for it. Then Dan backed out, and then a friend of mine started a little genre movie company, and so I said, hey, I saw this production. Said, hey, I want to do this. I knew I had a kind of an ace in the hole, which was I had I owned the rights to the sequels to Re-Animator or anything to do with Re-Animator. And so I said, I'll make the sequel to Re-Animator with you, but I want to direct it. I want to produce and direct. And I said, because I had heard from a French distributor once, he said, a first-time director usually makes 2 movies in one, his first and his last. And, I thought, well, I don't have any training to direct. All I've done is produce some movies. If my first movie is a dud, I need another chance. So I said, I'll make Bride of Re-Animator with you, but it's got to be a 2-picture deal, and that's the second one. And so they said, because I figured if the first one was terrible, I get another chance with Bride of Re-Animator. And so said, yeah. And so I jumped in. They were being financed by Japanese money. They were Brits, but one of them, Paul White, who I still do business with, he's a Brit that moved to Japan, married a Japanese, can read and write Japanese. And he was financing this company. It's called Wild Street Pictures. And with Japanese money back in the 80s, it seemed like Japan had all the money. And so the Japanese investors or companies that invested asked me if I would meet with a Japanese effects artist in LA and see if I could use them. And that was Screaming Mad George.
Screaming Society. So that's where this is coming.
Screaming Mad George, we went crazy and we made Society as the first movie.
Is it true that you famously said that you don't look at Society as an actual horror film?
Well, I kind of don't. It's kind of a weird movie, but I don't know if you really call it horror.
Well,
You know,
I see where you're coming from, but what I found, it might have been in the In Search of Darkness Volume 2 or 3 where you were interviewed for those, which I love. But the interesting thing about that to me, as a fan of the film, and I'm sure you, when the movie was coming out, might have saw it this way or maybe not. I got the impression that it was extremely marketed, even till this very day, considering it's a part of 80s horror documentaries, that it was extremely marketed in terms of like the artwork. It definitely has like that creepy look with the girl and the skin. It was marketed like a horror film through and
well,
through.
I mean, it has that. It doesn't really have gore, and it doesn't have this typical. I mean, it's kind of a thriller. I think it's. I like horror. Horror is not pejorative to me. I just don't. The first thing that comes to mind with that isn't a horror movie, but I'm happy for it to
Yeah.
be a horror movie. I just thought this is kind of a. It's more like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or something, you know.
Yeah.
Although it does have what people call body horror, but you know, most body horror up till that time, and most of it in general, is very gory and bloody. And in the shunting, I purposefully was careful to say we don't want any blood in the shunting. This is surreal. This is melding. If you put blood in it, it's just gonna. I just don't think it would have worked. It would have just been. I don't know. I think it would have just been a mess. And what I liked the bodies morphing and melding and all that. But it doesn't really matter to me what you
Right.
call it.
It's such, yeah, that I've talked to a lot of people. I've been doing like YouTube for about 12 years now, and it's funny when your films get discussed. I Over the last probably 6 or 7 years, Society is the one that's like, I love Bride or Re-Animator, blah, blah, but man, Society, I love it's because I don't think there's a whole lot of movies like Society. I mean, especially when it comes to genre films, it's like there may be some, but
That's
Society is very unique. It's like it's
it
kind of
is.
its own category.
That's why it's kind of like the Dr. Caligari. You know, it's nothing ever was again like Dr. Caligari.
Yeah.
You know, I think that, but it's true. It was not. It didn't get very. It didn't get good reception in the U.S. Even my friends kind of didn't like it. You know,
What did you
but
think
it
when you
did
first?
really
Yeah.
well in Europe and in England, and so that. But I think it just didn't work here. But 10 or 15 years later, it did. It just started, you know, it kind of grew. And you're right, part of it is because it wasn't seminal. It didn't influence a lot of other movies until I guess you get to The Substance and this kind of stuff. But I mean, it just, I think people didn't know what to make of it, you
Right.
know? And this was the Reagan era. This was the greed is good era. And this whole idea about making monsters out of upper class,
The
you know, in
yuppie
America at
kinda,
that time,
sure.
nobody even believed there was class. But in England, they did. In
They
France, they
did,
did.
didn't they?
In Italy, they did. And now today we do, you know. But and that was the fun of it to me is that, I mean, the original script that I got from Woody Keith and Rick Fry, I mean, I got the script because Rick Fry, you know, just came up to me on the street as I was coming out of my office one day and handed me the script. And I had been working on The Men, which was this really paranoid thing where this woman discovers that all men are aliens. There's this whole thing going on that is under the surface, and it's driving her crazy, paranoia, and that's the way the Society script was. It was this idea that this kid was going out of his mind because something was going on that made him feel like he was psychotic. It was too broad. It didn't have anything fantastical. In the original script, it was a blood cult. The Society were killing the kids and drinking their blood. And then it even, the day after the shunting, the kid, Billy is still at home, So it's the paranoia part of it was there, and that's what attracted me. But just like with Re-Animator, when I told Stuart that I wanted to make a feature and I wanted to have the guy with the head,
Yeah.
covered head in it. The same thing with Society. I just worked with George and Woody Keith and Rick Fry. Woody Keith by now he's changed his name to Zeph Daniel. But I told them that I wanted, I wanted this fantastic element. And I tried to, back then, this was the era when every Nightmare on Elm Street that came out, you were just going to it to see what the effects guys were doing now. I call them the rubber guys.
The rubber guys.
They had this methacellulose, they had this foam latex, they had all these new chemicals, and they were just making shit out of them and doing mechanical things, replacement. They would, you had these effects like in The Howling, and where they did substitution mechanicals.
It's amazing.
So change angles to make it change more than it could, and that stuff in the mid '80s was just like fun to go to the movies and see what The Thing, see what they're going to come up with next. And so when I thought, well, what effect, if I get the chance to make a movie, what effect do I want to see that I haven't seen? And I thought I'd like to see flesh melding into each other. That I would like. I imagined two people in a room. And so from there, I talked with George, and he was a Dali-esque painter. And so we did all this Dali stuff, and we actually just looked through a book of Dali paintings and picked out Dali images and made it the shunting,
It's amazing.
and kind of developed it from there. And so that was, it was a hell of a lot of fun. And I still think the shunting still works. The last 20 minutes of that movie, of course, it's just ridiculous, but it's got a sense of humor that carries it along. It's arch. It's not subtle, it's goofy, but you know what? It still works because it's puppets. If you think about it, if you like man in a suit monsters, the shunting is 13 people in a suit. That's how many people are under that big shunt. That's a suit. That's a suit monster. And I love. And then the original script was basically Woody Keith originated the script, and he is Billy. He's paranoid. He grew up in Beverly Hills in a big shot family, and he was very paranoid. And he kind of wrote that about his own world that he knew. So that was, the fact that it's society, that it's, society is all about keeping people out. It's
right.
about setting yourself above other people. And so the political part with it's intrinsic, at least the economic side of things, that economic side of being, I guess, economic political stuff. And then there was also already intrinsic in it, he had a sister, and there was this undercurrent of a little kind of an incest thing there, or at least, attraction. And I had read in a horror movie book that horror movies, David Scull, I think, wrote it. Horror movies are, they're generally dealing with taboos.
Right.
And the thing about one of the taboos that just doesn't go away is incest. And so I thought,
let's dance with that a little bit.
I'm going to push that,
right,
because I want it to, kind of be edgy. And so I thought that seems like seems like that's gonna work. And then I thought, and I grew up, I went to college in the late 60s when all the anti-war protests and stuff were happening. And everything was political back then. And it was a lot of fun. It was all kind of, us versus them, and capitalism, and all this politics, and it was a hell of a lot of fun. And I just thought, well, I wonder if I could I didn't want to do a vampire, a werewolf, Santeria, any of the typical. I thought maybe I can invent a new monster, by basing it on politics, class,
and that's another reason. All those things. I think that's another reason why people are finding that movie even more today, probably as much as any of your other ones. It's really cool because I saw Society maybe 10 years ago, and I was just like, "What the hell?" I agree about the humor, and I think ultimately for me, that's why the gross out works, because it's like we're having fun here, and yeah, it makes me want to watch it now. You discussing all of it.
Well, that's the same thing. I just, this last week they did a theatrical release of Re-Animator in 250 theaters across the country with the 4K. So it's a promotion for the 4K.
Sure.
That's what we're trying to get a lot of people to buy the 4K.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're not, it's. You would, and I saw it. I went to see it at a regular multiplex a week ago, and it was my daughter's birthday, and she'd invited a bunch of her friends. Now she and her friends, they're all lawyers, and they all got families, and they're not heavy metal or horror people or anything like that. And she drug them over of course, she grew up on horror movie sets and saw whatever. She saw Re-Animator when she was 5 years old.
Uh-huh.
And I went, and the 4K, I'd seen the 4K, of course, at the lab and all that, but to see it at a regular multiplex, because you don't know what the quality is going to be or anything, the 4K was really good. It was really, probably better in a lot of ways than the 35 millimeter film, because the film there, you always were going to the movies and they wouldn't change the bulbs enough, and the film would start getting scratched, and it wasn't always like it in Manhattan or in Westwood or in Hollywood, where you get the really good projection. I do think 35 millimeter film, there's a little more warmth to it. It's kind of like LPs versus
CDs and MP3s and
music.
Yeah.
When people who like vinyl and tube amplifiers and stuff, they swear by it. Well, I'm not an audiophile, so I just want convenience and good reproduction for my music.
Mm-hmm.
But people that I know who are audiophiles, oh man, they like to have that vinyl. They find texture and warmth in it that they don't get from the digital.
I'm one of those people.
And I think the same thing goes with the 35 millimeter. 35 millimeter, all things being equal, if you project 35 millimeter and you project 4K or whatever, a beautiful laser digital projection, in a way, the laser digital projection may be sharper, it may be more even, it may be more representative, but the 35 millimeter, if you've got a good print that isn't scratched up, you've got a good bulb, I think there is a kind of a little more emotion to it. I think
Sure.
The colors, maybe. I don't know. I do think there's something to it, but on the other hand, this 4K beats the hell out of most of the, I've got prints of Re-Animator, and I lend them out, and they show them at festivals and stuff. Well, they're kind of tired, you know, after time.
Yeah.
A film print, 40 years, it gets scratched up. I've got one print of Necronomicon. And, you know, nobody's seen Necronomicon because the company that made it was French. And then New Line got it, and they didn't do diddle squat with it.
Yeah.
And so nobody's seen it. It's not out. You can't buy it. You can't get a Blu-ray of Necronomicon, I don't think. Not in this.
No, my audience, when I said I was going to be able to talk to you, the number one question was ask Mr. Yuzna about Necronomicon. We want to see it.
Yeah, well, I don't own it. You know, I can't do anything. If I could, I would license it for North America, and I would do a 4K of it, because, you know, like most of the movies I've done, and Re-Animator is an exception, of course, they're not all that great. You know, it's not like they're really great movies, but most of them have something that I love in them, has really great shit in them. You know, okay, it's not gonna, you watch Re-Animator and it just holds together. Boom, from beginning to end, bang. You know, it's fun. The other movies can be up and down. Necronomicon's certainly one of them, but there's just some great stuff in that movie. And if you could, I mean, I know that if people had a chance to see it, if it started popping up, you know, AGFA, the American genre film, you know, it's basically the Alamo Drafthouse guys. Well, they handle theatrical for a ton of genre movies, and people like you could go, I want to, I don't know, I guess you're around Baton Rouge or something. You say, I got a theater down Baton Rouge, and I think I want to show some horror movies and have fun and maybe make a couple bucks. Well, you can call Alamo Drafthouse and license for very little money to show movies, and then have a good time. Well, Necronomicon's not available.
It's a shame.
Nobody can do it, you know. But I do have a print, and I have shown the print at the American Cinematheque here at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood. And, you know, I remember showing it. This was a number of years ago. And I think I probably have the only print, at least in the United States, right? Because I produced it and I had all the archives of it. And unfortunately, I only got one print. Well, I kept that print in my garage. And when they projected it, my heart sank. I mean, it had just gotten, it had suffered. And it was really dark. You couldn't see everything. And it deteriorated. And afterwards, I was very apologetic, but everybody was saying, "Oh, I like it. That looked authentic." I said, "No, I don't want that. I want it to look the way we wanted it to look.
Right.
I don't want people like it because it's all yellowed and old." You know, I remember going to see at a festival one time, or some kind of con or something. There was, I forget what movie I had there. And I think it was on the East Coast, and they showed a print of Phantasm, Don Coscarelli's first movie, which I love. I saw it in the theater when it came out. I love that movie. I think he was just brilliant. I think he was about 22 years old when he made it, you know, and it had lost all its color. You know, it kind of goes something. Film, sometimes when it goes old, it kind of starts turning pink. And I couldn't believe that they were showing that, you know?
Right.
And I thought, but I think, see, you could strike a new print for
Phantasm, like, yeah.
But, you know, people don't care. They love a movie because they saw it when they were young.
And crappy 4x3 VHS.
It doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't matter. You just, and like people were going, yeah, I like it because it looked like an old nostalgia thing. But for me, I don't want to see it that way. I want to see the way I want to see it the way it was meant to be seen. And I
I'm
think
like you. I'm like you.
Necronomicon,
Yeah.
I would definitely do a 4K of that. Oh my
Yeah.
God, I think that would kill, you know.
I think so too. Well, ladies and gentlemen, sorry for the bad news. I think they were hoping you would have some sort of magical answer, but I said, well,
You know, the thing is,
Brian, yeah.
the company that owns it is a company called Metropolitan, and it's in Paris, France. And I made a few movies with that company. Samuel Hadida. I made Necronomicon, and I made Crime Freeman, which is a movie nobody's even heard of, and it's really a good movie. It's a martial arts based on a anime, a manga, Crime Freeman, and it was directed by Christoph Gans. And Necronomicon, Samuel Hadida put up money into it. It was a co-production between his company Metropolitan and Take Chisei of Japan. Now, Take Chisei is the guy who created J-horror. So he produced The Grudge, the Ring, I forget all of them, Dark Water.
Dark Water, yeah.
So he produced all those, and we made Necronomicon because he put his director Shisuke Kaneko in it, and then Samuel Hadida put Christoph Gans. Christoph Gans went on to direct like Silent Hill, Brotherhood of the Wolf, that kind of stuff. And I don't know. I just think it's an uneven movie, but man, it is. I love it. I love Necronomicon.
Hopefully one day. I know that a ton of people want to see it, even if it ends up streaming somewhere. Mr. Yuzna, I got a few questions I want to ask you. Like I said, the movies you're involved in, there's a great history with your involvement on the production, stuff like that, especially like Bride of Re-Animator. And I want to say this to my audience. It's well documented. I've said this 1,000 times on my channel, so I'm not trying to be a kiss ass. My favorite Re-Animator, hands down, between the first one, Beyond, and Bride, is Bride. I think Bride is just the most fun Re-Animator film. I love that one so much. My question is, by 1990, when that movie was coming out and you were doing that film, did the first Re-Animator already have some sort of cult status, and were you a little nervous trying to do a sequel to that, or was this movie already in your head? You knew what it was going to be like, you had the plan, and you knew it was going to be a winner in your eyes?
No, I mean, Re-Animator was a huge success. I mean, the first screening of Re-Animator was almost exactly 40 years ago at the Cannes Film Market. Well, people call it the Cannes Festival in Cannes, France. But the Cannes Festival is the festival part. The part of it, there's also the thing they call the Marché du Film, which is the film market, where you buy and sell movies and finance them. And that's simultaneous. And I would go to the film markets. And Cannes, it was the first time I'd gone to Cannes, and we didn't even have, we had an answer print, which means it wasn't even a release print yet. It wasn't quite finished, but we brought the print over to show the buyers, and put up a midnight screening. I think it was on the 13th of May, 1985, at the Star Theater in Cannes. A midnight screening. It was raining. And it was amazing to me. It was the first time really a public showing of Re-Animator. And I was amazed because the line in the rain was around the block at midnight on the Rue d'Antilles. And I had gone, Stuart had told me to leave a note with Roger Ebert to get him to go, because he knew Roger Ebert from being in Chicago. So I dropped a note off at Roger Ebert's hotel, and he showed up for the screening. And there were so many people, it was a triplex. There were so many people, they let the overflow go into the next screening room, and they would show one reel and then move it to the next one. And of course, I watched in the main one, and the movie worked like gangbusters. At the end of it, people were stomping their feet and clapping their hands to the rhythm of the music and the credits.
Right.
And it got great reviews. It won the best film at the market from the French critics. It was that year, it was on top 10 lists for best film, not for best horror film, for just best film on a lot. I mean, this movie, the reviews were fantastic. It was, yes, the release didn't, well, first of all, for the release, I refused. I owned the movie. I paid for the movie. Nobody could tell me what to do, and I was damned if I was going to give it to the MPAA to tell me what to cut so it could be an R rating. Well, I knew what they would do. I've seen what they did. They'll just make it, they'll just take everything cool out of it until it's just sort of mediocre. And so I said, no, we're just going to release it unrated, which at that time meant you had to put an X on it. X didn't mean porno. I mean, it did because that's who put X's on their movie. But hey, what's the name of the movie? Midnight Cowboy was released X. You know, there were movies that did that weren't porn. But this, we just made it an X. It limited where you could promote it, and it limited the screens you could get because back then they were real strict about letting anybody under 17 to go see an X-rated movie. So it really limited the theatrical for it, but I didn't want it to be. I just wanted it to be the way we liked it, you know, the way it was supposed to be, which is what we're showing now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, you know, I kind of got roundabout. Yeah. But the movie worked really well. It was very successful. It wasn't a big theatrical for a couple reasons. First reason, it was a new company releasing it who had very little experience. They didn't have any clout in the market or anything. Secondly, it was an X-rated movie. So that limited where you could show it, how you could advertise it. And, you know, a lot of multiplexes just didn't even want to have something like that in their theater because some kid's going to go buy a ticket to some G-rated movie and then they're going to sneak in and their parents are going to get upset when they go see it. So no, the movie worked really well from the beginning. The video was out the roof. It made a ton of money. So for me to do Bride at first, I talked to Stuart. We always said we should do a sequel called Bride of Re-Animator, you know, in homage to the Universal Frankenstein. And there was a number of ways to go with it. And but I remember once Stuart and I were driving together, going to pitch some project at Warner Brothers or something. And Stuart had really good representation. He had a big time agent, you know. And I didn't. I'd never had an agent or a man because I was never that kind of guy, right? And he said, we were talking about Bride, and he said, my agent says I don't do sequels. I said, well, okay, you know, if you don't do, because they were trying to position him to be an A-list
Sure.
So, you know, this is after we had done From Beyond and after I had sued Charlie and all that. And so I said, okay, there's no problem. I had Stuart and Dennis Paoli and William Norris. I said, you guys get it. You guys, I owe you that you write the sequel. And so we started working on a script, and I thought, and then this was a version of Re-Animator that didn't get made, and we were working on that. The only thing from that version in that version, West and Dan are actually working for a mortuary, picking up bodies. And the one thing that I had in it that I never let go of is I had this image, like I had of the melding of the shunting, of this finger eye creature.
I knew you were going to say that.
And I just thought, that's the one thing I really wanted,
Right.
And it was before that, The Bride of Re-Animator actually picked up right after the end of the first movie. And we had this idea that Dan Kane was now working as the super in a apartment building. He had Meg down in the basement, like chained up because she was a little, and then it ended up at the White House and all this kind of stuff. But then we were working on this other version with the mortuary, and then this was like in February of 1987, I guess. And I think that was it, 87 or no, 88, 89. When was it? It was, I think we shot Bride of Re-Animator in 89. So it's been February of 89.
Mm-hmm.
We're working on the script. We're just still working on the treatment. And the guys who financed Society that I had a contract with,
that you picked your deal,
by Japanese money. Well, we had the money to make it, but the Japanese companies said that the money was there as long as we shot in the first week of June. And that probably had to do with taxes or fiscal year. You don't question the money guys, right? They said, that's the rule. You got the money, but you got to shoot by June 7th, right?
Oh, God.
And so this is February. We don't have a script. And Stuart was doing other stuff too, right? And so I think he was doing this vampire thing for TV. And I told him, I said, hey, I gotta shoot in June. And he said, well, we can't do it. He said, it's going to take us 6 months to get the script done. It's going to go past. I said, well, that's, I had 4 kids by then. That's not an option. We got to do this, And he was Stuart was always a very my way or the highway kind of guy. And I think it's because he was such a believer in the power of positive thinking. He was just, he used to think he could get a parking space just by being positive about it. And he was very determined to convince other people of his
thinking in a way, right?
And which was his huge.
Good for a director, huh? Yeah,
it was a huge strength. But in this case, I couldn't accept that. So
with the money people.
So I just paid them off, and I decided to just start over. With Woody Keith and Rick Fry, the guys who had done Society. So I had them come over. I said, we got to start from scratch. And they came over. I used to work here in my house late at night after my kids were in bed. And we started to, so we started developing it, and it was a totally different story, right? As you can tell. And it had a lot of openings, it had a lot of beginnings. And I went back to the Lovecraft stories and I thought, what haven't we used? What didn't we use in the first movie? We didn't have the war in it.
The war, yeah.
We didn't have the goop. In the story, Dr. Hill is not a doctor. He's a lieutenant. He's a pilot. And West and Dan are working in the World War I or something. And it could be World War I because he wrote it in the 1920s, but maybe he wrote it for World War I, or who knows. But anyway, they're working in a MASH tent or something. And this pilot, Lieutenant Hill, Captain Hill or whatever it is, Lieutenant, I think, crashes his plane. And these are like biplanes, right? And he crashes against the windscreen, and the glass takes off his head, and his head flies into the tent. West, and who we call Dan, is, and West has this cauldron in which he has biological specimens, and it has some kind of iguana, some kind of lizard stuff with the serum that makes things. You don't have to have a complete body to reanimate. You can have pieces of bodies will just meld together, kind of variety, right?
Right.
Well, in the movie Re-Animator, we have Dr. Hill's head alive just with the serum.
Right.
In the books, he needs that, what I call the goop. It's the reanimating goop that somehow means you don't have to have every nerve and every vein connected into a system to reanimate it. We just took that liberty in the first one because I wanted to have a severed head. So we just didn't explain it, right? We just jumped it. You know, it's kind of like when we were developing Re-Animator, and we would talk. We were Dennis Paley and Stuart and I. We'd say, and we go, well, you know, how can the head live? You know, if it's cut off. You know, and we talked about, well, maybe we've got to have veins or some. And then, how could it talk if it doesn't have lungs? And we thought about, well, maybe we'll put lungs with the head. And then we thought that's not very visual. That's terrible. You know, it's not real. That would not be good because horror movies that have talking heads, they're always cut off, you know. And then Stuart at one point said, look at Brian. In horror movies, heads can talk, okay?
Yeah.
You know? So that's the logic behind a fun horror movie as opposed to a serious horror movie. And so with the goop, and going back to the you know, Dr. Hill or Lieutenant Hill, his head flew into this goop that had tentacles and shit. And that's how he was able to live, he and his body separately. Well, what I wanted to do is I thought we got to have him in the war. And then we've got to have the iguana. And then we have to have what in the book, the narrator, who we called Dan Kane, I think he called it morbid, I forget something. I called it doodling with body parts. So the idea in the book is that Wes was just starting to fit shit together with this goop. And so I thought, well, we should do that. We wanted to do the, you know, in the book, Dr. Hill has, you know, in the book, West and Dan get a house by the cemetery that the basement has a wall that goes into a mausoleum, a crypt.
Right.
And West is throwing his failed experiments in there, and they all come to get him at the end, which in the book is questionable because Dan Kane is a raving maniac. So he's not a convincing narrator. He's you know. So anyway, so I thought we should have that, and so that's how I built Bride of Re-Animator. And to your point, I was just really scared that it wouldn't live up to Re-Animator and the fans. You know, I was really worried because I just wanted the fans of Re-Animator to accept it.
Oh, I mean, just to say, I mean, just as a fan, I gotta say the finale of Bride of Re-Animator is just so fantastical, and it's gorgeous to watch. It's so insane. I genuinely love that film, and I gotta ask you. I mean, it's kind of a hard question to ask you, and I don't know if you've ever been asked this directly. Do you think it's as good as the first Re-Animator?
No, of course not. I don't, and I'm not saying that to be modest or anything. It's just that I see the faults in it. It's there. It certainly suffers from having a less capable, accomplished director. I don't think there's a lot of faltering acting. There's places where the scene where it's uneven. No, it's not as good as the first one. But like I said, I'm not saying that all the movies I've made are some kind of wonderful. All I'm saying is that generally there's something really cool about it. And I went full operatic with Bride. I mean, I got the chance. In the first one they said, Dr. Hill, nobody will believe a talking head get a job in the sideshow. I thought, I'm putting fucking Dr. Hill's head in the sideshow. I did it because I own it. Nobody can tell me what to do. And I always like William Castle, like on House on Haunted Hill or something, where you'd see the heads coming up to the screen and talking to you. Elijah Cook Jr., the ghosts are coming, and the house of and I always loved that the heads they were ghostly. They would come up and talk to you. And so I thought, I'm doing that. And so I'm going to open the movie with Dr. Hill's head talking to the audience, except it'll be in full color with dripping blood out the neck, And so I love doing that stuff. I just love that. I just wish it was 3D. And then there was the whole thing with the Bride of making, because I think Wes always has to move his science forward. The idea was, okay, now he's got the goop. We're going to make new life, And then the Bride ends up at the end in the last 20 minutes. And I must say that when I didn't know what to do with that character except as a resolution. And by the time the movie was done, when you make a movie, sometimes when it's over, you go, oh, now I know what movie I should have made. I mean, I think you get that in a lot of lines of work. You go, oh, now maybe you do a podcast and you have
I should have asked this, or I should
go, oh, I should have gone this direction.
Sure.
It's always like, well, when the Bride comes up, she's such a great character. And by the time the movie is over, I thought, why did I waste so much time without her? No, she should have been through the movie. And that's why in Return of the Living Dead 3, I went, no, this is going to be the Bride all the way through the fucking movie.
I can't argue with you. You're the guy that did it. But no, that's what I love about it. I mean, there's something about Bride, and there's something so classic about it. I almost say Abbott and Costello. I feel like I could watch this movie in black and white.
Well, I think probably one of the 4 best Universal monster movies is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Of course, right? There's something. That's why I love Bride so much. It's like I can't believe I'm trying to argue with you. I'm saying it's at least to me. I'm
talking to you about reality. You're talking as a fan.
I totally understand that. I just want you to know because I'm sure you get it, but it's just like I truly love Bride. It's one of me and my wife's favorite movies. We just love it so much. But my favorite horror movie of all time is Return of the Living Dead. And when I was watching these films, getting to 3 was such a great experience because it was so different. And I don't know if this has ever been said to you, but it almost feels like a Re-Animator film in like its guts a little bit. And naturally, when I saw you directed it,
I'll tell you that when I went to one of those Masters of Horror dinners, and Quentin Tarantino came in and sat down across from me, and then he started talking about saying, Return of the Living Dead 3 with a couple of tweaks is a Re-Animator movie. So you're right on, at least with the great T,
Well, because it's about trying to regain life in a sense, but when it comes to Return of the Living Dead 3, God, there's so much stuff I love about that film. But one of the things, because I want to respect your time. We've been going well over an hour now, but like I said, the Return of the Living Dead films are my all time favorites. I love the guy that you picked to write that, John Penny.
Yeah.
And you guys did gorgeous, and I love those interviews you did for Vestron where you guys just talked about the movie. You've talked about casting Melinda. I mean, obviously, you hit a home run with her. I mean, I can't imagine who else you would have gotten to do that movie. Um, I'm interested, like, because I don't remember how much clarity was put into this. I'm assuming you watched part two either when you were getting ready to get the job or you were offered the job for part three. Was that something you had done where you actually sat down and saw the actual Return of the Living Dead part two beforehand?
No, when I was actually, I actually visited the set of Return of the Living Dead. Dan O'Bannon's. That's where I met Dan, and I love that movie. I think Dan O'Bannon, who maybe his greatest thing was writing Alien.
Sure.
He's the guy that brought H.R. Giger into horror. He was a really offbeat, but really just a uniquely talented writer. I won't go into it because I'll talk for 2 hours about Dan O'Bannon. So I love that movie. He's the guy that I think showed movie makers how to make an EC Comics movie. So EC Comics, for the people, I'm sure most of your viewers are aware of the horror comics of the 40s and 50s, which I'm a kid of the 50s. So I grew up, I bought horror comics before I ever saw a horror movie. Because comics is, every kid had a comic book in his back pocket when I was growing up, right? You sat down, you looked at your comic, and I got horror comics. EC Comics, the Tales from the Crypt and all that kind of stuff, they were gooey and gory. There was women always killing their husbands. There was always heads being chopped off and brains being eaten. And the censors hated it, and the culture hated it, and they tried to shut it down along with Mad Magazine. Well, in the 70s, the kids that grew up with horror comics and regular comics started making movies. And of course, they make what they like when they were kids. But everybody tried to do comic books the way the Batman TV show did it, by having glam and cow and making it be really kind of three primary colors, and
right,
up to Creep Show, which, remember Creep Show, they had comic book pages. They'd go into frames. This is not how you do a comic book on film. Who taught us? It was Dan O'Bannon. Return of the Living Dead is an epic EC comic as a film, with all the fun and gore and sex, just pure delirium. If he hadn't done that, Joel Silver never would have been able to do Tales from the Crypt.
You're right.
He was doing it like Creep Show. Dan O'Bannon was the one that, in my book, is the one that did that. Okay, I think I love that movie. And then when I was and then the second one was actually
Ken Wiederhorn,
by a friend of mine, Ken Wiederhorn. Well, Ken Wiederhorn was he's not really such a horror guy.
Right.
And I think they told him it had to be a kind of a comedy horror. If you want to contrast that with a horror comedy. Now, maybe you call Return of the Living Dead a comedy. Maybe you call Re-Animator a comedy. I don't think it's a comedy. I think it's ironic, and it definitely is funny. But I think then on the other hand, then on the top of that, Return of the Living Dead 2 was financed by Japanese companies, as so many movies were back then. And they wanted the same actors and even the same characters who had already
Who
been
died
in the first movie.
right.
And then they wanted the teenagers, and they wanted the, I think it just was, and there's a lot of money there too, but it didn't work. It didn't work theatrically. And so the rights that Joe Wolf owned, who owned Return of the Living Dead, became very much less valuable. And at that time, I was doing a lot of different stuff, but I was working with a couple, Joel Castleberg and Anissa Miner, and their agent had thought that that they could get the rights to the third one, and they asked me if I would direct it. And so we were working on a story. The only thing I wanted to do was have the main character be a zombie. Because even back then, I thought there'd been so many zombie movies that you got to do something to shake it up.
Right.
And so I thought if you make the main character a zombie, that changes the dynamic, so it'll at least be original. It turned out that they were unable to get the rights. And at that time, I was working with a company called Trimark Pictures, and the head of it, Mark Amin. I was working on Warlock 2.
Right.
I was going to do Warlock 2, and so I was working on the script of that with the writer, and we were developing Warlock 2. And then Mark Amin came to me one day and he said, "Hey, you know what? We've got this. We've got the rights to do Return of the Living Dead 3. Would you like to do that?" I said, "Hell yeah." So I left the other, and now we had a project that was a blank slate, and it was time to start hearing pitches from writers. And I'd already heard a lot of pitches from writers when I was working with Joel Castleberg and Anissa Miner. And they were all a lot of them were kind of like, Walking Dead kind of stuff, It was that kind of a zombie thing. And I wanted like I said, I wanted the main character to be a zombie. And when I got the pitch from John Penny, he had this Romeo and Juliet thing going.
It's brilliant, yeah.
And the military making weapons out of it, and that whole thing about the freezing them, like you send them into war and then you freeze them. And not only, the idea I thought was the best. Also, I got along with him real well. I still work with him all the time, yeah. And so that's where we started the process of developing the script. And I was like with Society or a lot of the movies that I make, I'm very much into, like with Society, I always thought Society, the movie, it's like an iceberg. Just 10% of it is on the screen. But there's this whole logic underneath there that supports that 10%. And I'm not the guy that wants to do the scene with the scientist getting on the blackboard and explaining it. I figure if you don't get it, then, bad on you.
Can't help you. Yeah.
Or bad on the one who's trying to express it. But I hate it being explicated. You want the staging to tell the story. So with Return of the Living Dead, I was basically channeling the Bride of Re-Animator and going, this, and also in the original Return of the Living Dead, they say it hurts, being dead. That was one of the most poignant parts.
I love that.
Return of Living Dead. But so then I tried to come up with I asked Trimark, okay, because I watched the second one. And I said, well, what do you have? What are the requirements here? does it have to be, do I have to put the actors from the other ones in? And Mark Amin said, no. And I said, do I have to have the characters from the other ones in the movie? They said, no. I said, does it have to be funny? He said, no. Well, actually, I was talking to the head of creative affairs, Dave Trippett. And then I said, well, what's the requirement? Just tell me what the requirement is. They said, you got to have the trioxin.
Trioxin.
You got to have brain eating. And I said, okay.
I can work with that.
You know, almost all the movies I do have ironic humor in them. And for some goddamn reason, I didn't want to go there with Return 3. And I always also was really cognizant and really happy to realize that I was making the second sequel to the alternate sequel of the movie that changed horror for us. Because I think the Night of the Living Dead is the turning point.
Absolutely.
In horror for at least my generation. That's when things changed. It was Night of the Living Dead. It was George Romero. Then he did Dawn of the Dead, which brought a little, well, Night of the Living Dead did have some humor with the rednecks at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, but that was great. That lifted it up. Dawn of the Dead, which Dario Argento was involved with, now they had that great tagline on the poster. When hell is full,
the dead will walk the earth.
Fucking A, that's my idea of a zombie.
Oh,
Through all this, we've got AIDS, or we're, it's a disease, or it's, the pandemic. I hate all that stuff. But and he went way into the satire with the shoppers,
right?
With their, zombies. But he had incredible, just real horror scenes, like the beginning in the tenement building, where the first time you've ever saw a neck being bitten, and that stretchy skin kind of thing, which is just great, And when they go down in the basement, and the preacher's down there, and man, that is real horror, and the helicopter blades hitting the head off. That's just wonderful, So there was, but it had all this, real, real kind of ironic satire in it. Now, the Living Dead movies went on to kind of believe their own press about how they're really social commentaries and not really a horror movie, except Tom Savini never got the message. He kept doing fun stuff. Well, John Russo, the writer of Night of the Living Dead, had the rights to the name Living Dead. And so George Romero's movies after Night of the Living Dead had to be Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Diary of the Dead. And John Russo had the rights to Return of the Living Dead. And
he wrote the book.
I actually read a paperback book that he
I have it
called Return of the Living Dead. It's about like a school bus or something that crashes. But so that's why I say that Return of the Living Dead was an alternate sequel to the movie that changed horror. And now I got to do the second one, and I wanted it to not only be a sequel to Return of the Living Dead, but I wanted it to be a sequel to Night of the Living
Dead. That's brilliant. That makes perfect sense.
I think that's why I didn't go for the funny, because there's nothing funny in Return of the Living Dead. But I tried to channel as much of the incredible effects in Return of the Living Dead, the Tar Man. Tar Man is just the best.
Classic.
So I tried to do those kind of effects. I don't think I got to the level of Tar Man, but I got a bunch of good, good character, a bunch of good effect kind of zombie things. And then I was focused on trying to figure out a logic for brain eating, because brain eating is just funny unless you got a logic. And so I didn't want it to be just funny like a comic book. And so I thought, why is it that when triaxin gas hits you, that that instead of just being back to life, the living dead is a fucking maniac. What's wrong? And why are they eating brains? So I decided to make a logic out of it by saying that what it is that when you come back to life, you're alive, but your nervous system is dying. It's because you're decaying and you're aware of it. The first thing that decays isn't your skin, it's your nerves. And that's what hurts. That's why it hurts. And so when they're chewing the flesh, splitting off from the Night of the Living Dead, where it's just cannibalism, which is awful in the 60s, it's that they're getting whatever nerves are in the flesh. And then where are the most of them? Right there. And so that's how that was the way to develop Julie, was to make her know that her whole job, she had to have a rock, she had to have claws so she could break open the oyster and take out the gooey part, because she just was in pain. The only other thing, and then of course we want it to be a love story, so the only way she could get the pain to end is to eat the nerves, the brain, or love. And that makes it, Romeo and Juliet.
The romance. Such a, yeah. One of the things, this is, you mentioned John Russo a second ago. Was there ever, this is kind of a nerdy question, but was there ever any notion to reach out to him, since he was the proprietor, I guess, of The Living Dead, to say, would you care to pen a treatment or anything like that? Or was it?
I don't know why, but it didn't come up. I mean, I don't know why. I had met him once at some convention, but I didn't know him. And I think what happened was that the Trimark Joe Wolf sold the rights to Trimark. And I think what had happened is the Return of the Living Dead was a huge hit, and it made a ton of money. And then Return of the Living Dead 2 took all the stuffing out of it. And then the value of the next sequel was very low, which is why I could do it. And Trimark they came and they said, here, do whatever you want, and here, pick a writer or get submissions. It never came up. It would have been a good idea to talk to him, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe we would have. I don't know. Maybe we would have made his paperback.
One of the things that's so cool, you mentioned this on an interview that I watched, and so I went online and I spent way too much money to get this, but this is a Spanish collector's edition Blu-ray release where it was in fact titled Mortal Zombie, which I think it's fantastic.
It's a cool title, and it works in English. But I think what really works good, what I like about it, is that Return of the Living Dead 3, one of the weaknesses of it, because it didn't do anything theatrically, although that also had to do with Trimark at that time had just started doing theatrical releases.
That was gonna be my next question, by the way.
So what they did is they put out Leprechaun.
That was Trimark, you're right.
And Leprechaun crazily did real well. It was like a kind of a crazy, funny thing. And so then they thought, well, we've got this cracked. It's like Ghoulies, right? You're a fledgling distributor.
Company, you get lucky, just shoot them out.
And so then they put out Warlock 2, which got finished before Return 3, because we were almost finished with the script when I bailed, and it didn't work. So now they lost a bunch of money and they're gun shy. So when Return 3 was done, they just perfunctorily put it out there. They didn't really give it any theatrical. The theatrical release was just enough so that, sometimes you've got to do a theatrical release to satisfy the video deals that you made. to get the minimum guarantees from the video deal. They say, yeah, we're going to put it in so many theaters, but they didn't put anything behind it. And I think it suffered also because it was sold as a Return of the Living Dead movie. And it's a very awkward title, Return of the Living Dead 3. Then what do? You put another colon and put ashes to ashes? It just gets to be this cumbersome, stupid kind of title that doesn't work, And so it really isn't the movie that someone that loved Return of the Living Dead is going to love, because they're going to expect, to have that kind of dancing on the grave, the naked girl on the grave, and the, Linnea Quigley, and the people running and saying more brains, send more paramedics, the whole comedy part of it. This wasn't that movie, and the title is too cumbersome. Well, I think with Spain, they put Mortal Zombie. Well, that's its own title. It's not trading off of being a sequel. And I think Return of the Living Dead 3 doesn't need to be a sequel. It's not. It's a standalone movie.
It is.
The movie just didn't do anything. Nobody really watched it. I don't even think it did that good on video. But I think it's one of the most organic movies I've made as a director. It is the movie we set out to make. I think it's much more. It doesn't have the digression, the unevenness that something like Bride of Re-Animator or Necronomicon have.
Well, I think it's got it may be my favorite scene from a movie you've directed in it, which is that ballistics technician scene where you guys had hired that homeless gentleman to come in, and it's such a chaotic.
Clarence Epperson.
Clarence. Yeah. It's such a chaotic scene. And the funny thing about this scene is, as a fan by that point, I knew what was going to happen, but he was such a great, creepy looking zombie in that yellow color and stuff. It's so chaotic. I love it. And the reaction of the dad on the other side of the glass and everything, he's just like, oh shit. It's such a, I'm sure you get this a lot when you talk to fans at conventions and when they come to meet you. It's your movies, they're so fun and they're so rewatchable. And I don't know how you set out to make a movie rewatchable, so to speak, but a lot of your movies just have that quality. I can't tell you how many times I've watched Return of the Living Dead 3. As you probably know, there are more that came out from Sci-Fi with Tom Fox, but people look at it as a trilogy. And Brian, I dare say, 3 has probably twice, maybe 3 times as many fans as part 2. Like 1 and 3 are definitely the fan favorites out of the 3 of them. And it's not hard to see why, because 3 is so unique. And I've watched the stuff on the Vestron Blu-ray, which I would not doubt that when Vestron Video put out that Blu-ray maybe 7 or 8 years ago, probably the highest selling Vestron title they did. I would not be surprised. But you guys did such great work with the special features, and the fact that you were meeting the lead actor at midnight because that's when he could show up on set to be there. The fact that you guys, I think you said you hired like 4 separate different effects groups.
Well, really 5.
5.
That's another topic. I did that on Bride too. I've always been big. I'm not the guy that says we have a low budget for effects, so let's give it all to one company. I don't do that. I like to have an effects coordinator. I like to bid out effects, break them down, and I take the big effect, like Julie. Her design, you need somebody really good. This is the
money shot on camera.
This is the title character, and so I got Steve Johnson, who is one of the great effects.
Legend.
Yeah.
Legend.
But when it comes to Riverman with his exoskeleton.
Oh, I love Riverman. Yeah.
So we got a guy who isn't even an effects guy. He's a metal worker. That's real iron that actor's wearing.
You're kidding me.
Yeah. See, if I'd gone to a regular rubber guy, what they would have done is they would have spent all their money sculpting these pieces, pouring foam latex or whatever plastic in there, pulling it out, sanding it down, painting it meticulously. And when the actor puts it on, the actor's going to have to pretend it's heavy. Or just get a metal worker and make it out of metal. And by God, you don't have to pretend, you know. So that's one way to go. Some of the littler effects are done by the art department, you know. I just think you need to get the effects guy. If you're, like I said before, if you want a head cut off, don't give it to Screaming Mad George. Give him something weird to do. Something. Give it to some guy that's been working in a shop for one of the big rubber guys, and he gets to have his credit with a head getting cut off. And by God, he's going to, for very little money, give you the best head. He's going to be creative because this is his chance. Don't give it to the big company. They're going to throw it away. You know, you want creativity.
All my viewers, please comment below and tell Brian thank you for giving us so much time and letting us talk.
Adios, horror fans.
Okay, Brian, thank you so much. Have a great one.
Bye-bye.
Have a great one. Huge, giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind-the-scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.